in an old farmhouse on the outskirts of Munich in the workshop of Ralf Kurschewitz. Now, with the sun's first rays, together with his colleague Mick Manhard, Ralf wants to get the VW 181 ready for the new season after the long winter. For months, the bucket has stood under a tarpaulin. Without doing too much work, Ralf wants to try the first start. It's been standing over the winter for around 5 months, and it may be that one needs to pump it a bit before it starts because there's usually no more fuel inside the carburetor. But normally, not much happens over the winter. Now, let's look at the oil. Somehow it has got lost a bit, I get the feeling. Better safe than sorry before the first drive. It's just over minimum, so for the first test drive, you can leave it like that, I think. After almost half a year standing, Ralf has only to check the oil on the VW. Then he can try using the bucket for the first time. Okay, it's possible.
Super, reliable, your bucket car.
That's because it's an air-cooled VW. So really, that doesn't surprise me at all that it starts first time. This is actually normal for an air-cooled VW. They're pretty reliable. A car on which one can always rely. No wonder, indeed, the Type 181 has the engine from probably the most reliable car of all time, the VW Beetle. Ralf starts right away with the first test drive of the new season and enjoys the convertible feeling. So after the long winter, once again open driving in the sun, which is totally awesome. I look forward to it every winter. It's just crazy, it's totally fun. But the fun is short-lived. Then Ralf discovers a technical problem on the engine. Yeah, something wrong on the carburetor. It's sort of jerking rather strangely. Does just not have a proper idle. So when accelerating, it's not really pulling. You can tell it does not rev up. Somehow it's only coming now, and I already noticed last fall that there was something wrong. In 1969, when the first humans landed on the moon, VW launched its outdated 181 model. Built for the German army, it didn't find many fans. With a convertible, most people imagined something else. So this is the VW 181, built in the 70s in a production number of around 150,000. Main customer was the military. And vehicles were also sold to civilians, but the price was simply too high, so it was a flop for VW in the end. As you can see, turn signals, headlights, hubcaps, and generally about 90% of the engineering is taken from the Beetle. The rest comes from the VW bus. You can see here, for example, the mirrors, the wheels of T1, door handles from the T2. The instrumentation is standard and actually very Spartan. I've upgraded, for example, the tachometer, oil temperature gauge, fuel gauge for an additional tank, which is housed under the front hood. And a little more comfort here with a little softer wheel. And this is basically a regular 1600 Beetle engine, a 4-cylinder boxer, air-cooled, 50 horsepower, short, sturdy, and reliable as we know it. This is a rather small trunk, which is normally occupied by the spare tyre, which is now behind at the door and through the heater, which I've thrown out. Instead, there is now a 40-litre auxiliary fuel tank to increase the range, which is very important for long-distance travel. Also available here are various accessory things and some spare parts, shovels and things that you need. Yeah, the paint, well, okay, this is example, it's not that nice, but I travel a lot off-road and in the desert and so on. It would ultimately be money thrown out of the window to complete an expensive paint job on it, which would then come off as quickly. It's not pretty, but I like it a lot, it's fun, you can drive off-road, drive open. So for me, it's actually the most beautiful car out there. With the most beautiful car that there is, Ralf goes back to his workshop after a brief test ride to repair the defective carburetor with colleague Mick.
And is he sensible?
No, I thought already from the start that there's something wrong with the carburetor. You could fix it, but I would say before we tinker around with it, let's put in another one. I have one lying around and I know that that works, so let's not stress now. So I think the last time they replaced the carburetor was when I replaced the engine. That was a few years ago. Normally there's not much broken. In only 20 minutes, Ralf replaces the carburetor, and he knows exactly what you must pay attention to when installing a new one. You can reuse old gaskets in the carburetor, then it can pull in outside air. That is bad for the engine because then it might get too hot because it's emaciated. Then otherwise, when installing directly, you can't go wrong. One should reset it again afterwards, idle and CO level. More than 20 million models of the Beetle were built, which also works well in the bucket. Fully developed and reliable, yet easy to get hold of. So this is a Beetle technology tested 1 million times on the other hand. The supply of spare parts is still, of course, very good today. Unlike the Beetle, however, in the rear of the 181 there is much more space to work on the engine. So step on the gas pedal.
Yes?
So that I can see if the accelerator cable is still installed properly.
Okay.
If the gas cable is too long, then you cannot give full throttle. If it's too short, there are also problems. So step on it, stay on it. So I'm a little bit perfect. If you have no more free play, then it's almost always pulling on the throttle shaft or at the throttle. Then over time you break the butterfly valve. And that's why it should have a little play in it. The throttle cable fits. Now Ralf wants to start the engine with the new carburetor. Like a new engine, the Boxer jumps to life, and Ralf is happy with the setting of the carburetor. It has a nice smooth idle, no stuttering. If it continues, then that's wonderful. I guess that's it right now. Test drive. Now Ralf takes the second test drive of the day. If the carburetor holds and no other problems arise, then the VW is ready for the season after only half an hour of preparation. Yeah, with the carburetor change, the car drives really well today. Ralf has missed the unique driving experience of the Type 181 over the last 5 months. Driving is very pure. So you hear everything, you just get everything very direct. In that everything is not as insulated or everything is Spartan. So there's no elaborate interiors, no rugs, it's just very purist. It has to be purist. Classic car fan Ralf does without carpets, comfort and electronics. Yeah, in a modern car, pretty much everything is different. It's quiet, boring, ugly, whereby the bucket is actually also ugly too. But boring is, I would say, the main difference. The new car that can do everything and it does everything automatically, where the bucket, one has to do it oneself, and I think along and experiences everything a bit more intensively, I would say. Those who want to experience the feeling of intense driving with the 181 need to pay at least 7,000 euros for a well-preserved model, but top models can also cost almost 15,000 euros. Yeah, I have to take a look at perhaps the oil temperature. Air-cooled VW engines tend to overheat a bit because you have to, especially when you're driving in the desert, you have to look a little that the temperature stays within the tolerable range. Otherwise, the bucket does what you'd expect from a VW. It runs and runs and runs. With the aerodynamics of a wardrobe and almost 50 horsepower, of course no outstanding performance figures are to be expected from the VW 181. So, thanks to this short translation, it accelerates pretty well at the bottom. Obviously, up at the top, it runs out of breath a bit. There's just a little bit out power missing, and the top speed, therefore, is only good for around about 100 kilometers per hour. The bucket needs more than 30 seconds to get from 0 to 100. So to drive comfortably on the country roads is no problem. It becomes dangerous if you drive too fast into the curves. It's possible that the pendulum axis collapses and breaks out at the rear, especially if the road is wet. Another reason to drive the bucket carefully. The brakes on the bucket car correspond with the Beetle, and due to the greater weight of the vehicle, one has to step on them a bit, but you get the tires to lock. So I would say sufficient braking effect in spite of drum brakes all round. So personally, I like the bizarre appearance, this edge with beading, and and very much like to drive with the top down with the windscreen flat and a bit into the country. And Ralf wants to go there now. Beforehand, he makes a brief stop at the barn. Ralf is again back with his favorite old-timer in his small workshop. Together with colleague Mick, he is changing the tires. Yes, in the spring, of course, there's always a proper test drive on the road, and that includes heavy tread off-road tires. These here have a bit of a profile, but now it's so muddy and wet, you really have to put the right road tires on it. The wheel change is the opportunity to once again explain the pendulum axis in detail. Yeah, you can see here the swing axle. The peculiarity is that this only has one joint inside, and we see here also that the wheel is turned slanted a little bit during rebound. So say the fall is positive, and this can lead to very fast cornering, so it loses the cornering drive and the rear breaks out. So that the bucket doesn't lose traction on the rough ground, it gets thick cleats instead of M&S tires. The strength of the bucket in this field is for sure the lightweight. Even when it's bogged down, you can actually get relatively quickly back on the road again. And if someone pushes or pulls, you're usually right back out of some hole. And critical passages begin here already in the humid forest. VW described the 181 not as an off-roader, but as a commercial vehicle for streets as well as off-road. The fact that it takes a bit of momentum on rough ground goes back to the fact that the four-wheel drive and differential locks are missing. So if you can balance that a bit with the heavy tread tires and momentum. And with a long start-up run, the bucket seems to master the slippery hill. Another strength of the bucket on rough ground is probably the ground clearance. Although one can still improve it with a lift kit, especially with larger wheels, and through this one doesn't sink in so easily and has a larger contact area. Of the approximately 4,000 German VW 181 owners, only a very few will have made such extreme off-road trips with their buckets as Ralf. Yeah, advantageous in the off-road area is also the short gearing, for example, especially with the so-called countershaft gears, and gives an additional reduction. The intermediate kinematic mechanism reduces the speed of the drive shaft. Yeah, of course you can still get stuck. So like I said, wet meadows are not necessarily its thing. Gravel or sand, or generally in the case of dry rocky terrain though, because it actually goes very well, precisely because of its good ground clearance. The differential does not have anything hanging out, and one has to watch out a bit in steep slopes. The bucket car does not have a roll bar, so if one falls on the roof it's obviously quite dangerous. Harmless, on the other hand, water crossings with the bucket, thanks to its high ground clearance and simple design. Yeah, with the technology, little can happen when crossing water. First, the engine is bolted, so a surge of water does not easily get into the engine, even when the engine is running full of water. It also happened to me, and then you have to basically change the oil and can actually go further again. With the electronics, we have so far not had too much go wrong. Those with the normal bucket are better off not to go on the rough terrain like Ralf. Yeah, from my perspective, my bucket is a real SUV due to the various modifications. Not a normal standard bucket, since you can have a ride up a dirt forest road, but rather not really an SUV. So I was with this bucket several times in the Sahara, and we were told very often that you should not use this car in the country, especially not go into sand dunes, but we have proven the contrary. We went on up to 200 kilometer long on pure dune routes, which no one would have thought possible. But also there were these knobbly tires, so the mud and the slush. I've also come through better than many off-road drivers thought. However, an off-road tour in simple countryside with the 181 is always an adventure. Yeah, I would say the appeal to drive with the bucket car off-road lies exactly in the fact that this is not an off-road vehicle actually, and just to look what is possible, to test boundaries. And it's just a driving challenge, but somehow Try to drive where you at first think that it won't work. That's really the attraction. And the bucket will never lose its appeal for Ralf. So the bucket is actually my favorite car, and I don't know right away any substitute for it.